was already talking when I picked up the channel. Not to me specifically. Raymond talked to the road the way some guys talk to themselves in a mirror, just processing out loud, not needing an answer. I was eastbound on I-80 somewhere past Rawlins, maybe 40 miles ahead of him, running the same frozen corridor I'd been running for 3 years. He came through on Channel 19 mid-sentence, the way he always did, and I reached over and turned the squelch down to catch the full signal. He said the painted lines were gone. I want to be clear about what he meant, because when you say that to someone who doesn't drive long haul, they picture something vague, a road-tired hallucination, a man who needed sleep. That's not what Raymond meant, and that's not what he said. He meant the center stripes, the white dashes on I-80 between Rawlins and Laramie that you lock onto at 2 in the morning when there's nothing else to look at, when the high desert on both sides of you is just black nothing, and the wind is shaking the cab, and the road is the only thing telling you where the world is. He said they were gone. He said the road felt like it was going somewhere that wasn't on the map. I told him the paint fades on that stretch. I told him DOT doesn't restripe it often enough. It's a known complaint. Other drivers have said the same thing. He said, yeah. He said probably, the way a man says yeah and probably when he isn't convinced but doesn't want, to make something out of nothing at 2 in the morning in the middle of Wyoming. That was October 14th, 1998, somewhere around 2:05 a.m. Raymond had been running the Cheyenne to Reno corridor for 6 years at that point, eastbound with frozen beef out of a Heartland freight depot, westbound empty week in and week out until he knew that road the way some people know their own kitchen, not consciously, just with his body, with his hands on the wheel, with a part of his brain that doesn't need to announce itself. He knew where the grade lifted outside of Laramie. He knew the exact crosswind gap in the rock cut near exit 272 that would push a loaded trailer sideways if you weren't already correcting for it. He'd told me once he could drive the whole run with the GPS off and a dead phone and still hit every fuel stop within 5 minutes of schedule. He was also a careful man in small ways that added up. He checked his tire pressure at every fuel stop even when he'd just checked it at 2 hours before. He kept a paper backup of every delivery confirmation because he didn't trust the Qualcomm not to drop a record. He had a thermos system, 1 thermos per leg, filled fresh at the start, no top-offs, so he always knew exactly how much caffeine was in him. Small disciplines, the kind a man builds over years when he takes the job seriously enough to want to still be doing it at 60. That's the kind of driver Raymond was. Not reckless, precise, there's a difference, and it mattered later when investigators were trying to figure out how a man like that could disappear from a road he knew by feel. His Cobra 29, he'd had it since before his daughter was old enough to remember. One of the older units with the big squelched dial he'd duct-taped in place after it cracked. That radio never went fully quiet. Even when Raymond was sleeping at a truck stop, even when he wasn't talking, you'd hear a road noise through the mic if you were on his channel. The hum of the engine, the sound of wind pressure against the cab. 3 years running parallel schedules on the same corridor, I'd come to think of that background noise as proof of life. Not dramatically, just the way you know someone's home because their light is on. At 2:20 I gave him the 2-key click we used as a check-in. Nothing came back. At 2:35 I tried again, and what I got was not static, not road noise, not even the particular silence of a radio that's been turned down. What I got was the channel being empty in a way I hadn't heard it be empty before. There's a texture to dead air on a CB, a kind of white noise presence. This wasn't that. This was the channel simply having nothing in it, like the frequency had been vacated. I told myself he'd stopped at a pull-off to sleep. I drove another 30 miles telling myself that. Wyoming State Patrol found his rig at 6:48 the next morning, parked on the eastbound shoulder at mile marker 221. The trooper found it because the flashers were on. Raymond had an off-brand hazard bulb on the driver's side, slightly different amber than the passenger's side, one orange and one true amber, and that mismatched flicker caught the trooper's eye in the gray pre-dawn light. He pulled up behind it expecting a medical situation or a mechanical one. The frozen beef load was intact. The reefer temperature was logged correctly. The engine was running. And in the cup holder on the driver's side, Raymond's 32-ounce thermos, the one with the Heartland Freight logo half peeled off the side, the one he refilled at every fuel stop, the one I'd seen in his hand at 100 truck stop counters. That thermos was still giving off steam when the trooper unscrewed the lid. Here's the thing about that detail that nobody addresses directly in the incident report. Coffee in an open thermos loses steaming temperature in cold air within 12 to 15 minutes, depending on the starting temperature and the ambient. October in Wyoming at elevation, the air that morning was running at about 34 degrees. The trooper filed his report at 6:48 a.m. Raymond had last been on Channel 19 at approximately 2:05 a.m. That is 4 hours and 40 minutes. That coffee should have been stone cold. It should have been cold enough that nobody would have thought to mention it. Instead, it was mentioned twice, once in the narrative section, once in the evidence log, noted as remarkable. Nobody from Wyoming DCI ever explained the coffee. Not in the 8 months they worked the case. Not in the summary when they moved it to inactive. The coffee is in the file, and then the file moves on, like the coffee isn't an impossible thing sitting inside a mundane sentence. The cab door was half-latched, not open, not fully closed, resting against the frame with the latch just barely caught. If you've driven a truck, you already understand why that's wrong. A truck door is heavy. You don't ease it shut. You push it and it catches with a sound you feel in your shoulder. In 40-mile-an-hour wind, a half-latched door would have blown open within seconds unless something was holding it from outside. Nobody was noted as holding it from outside because there was nobody there. The door was just wrong in a way the report describes accurately and doesn't try to explain. No footprints off the shoulder. The wind that night ran consistent at 38 to 42, according to the National Weather Service station, at Laramie Regional. Gravel shoulder, sustained wind, 4+ hours, there wouldn't be tracks. That's not suspicious. That's October in Wyoming. The wind does not conspire, it just blows, and it blew. And whatever might have been pinned to that gravel was long gone before the mismatched. Flashers caught anyone's eye in the morning. 8 months. Wyoming DCI pulled Raymond's financials, interviewed everyone on the Heartland Freight roster who ran that corridor, checked hospitals in 3 states, talked to his ex-wife and his daughter, and a couple of other guys I knew from the same route. They went through his delivery history looking for anything irregular, anything that might indicate he owed someone something, or knew something he shouldn't. They found a man with no enemies, no debt beyond a reasonable truck payment, no history that pointed anywhere useful. They had nothing at the start, and nothing when they quietly moved the file to a shelf where cases go when there's no investigation left to work, but nobody's willing to say it out loud. What came out during that investigation, not publicly, not in any official release, but in documents I was shown once by a DCI investigator who'd worked the case and seemed, years later, like a man who needed someone else to know, was the CB tape. Raymond's Cobra 29 had a weather alert recording function, an older feature built into some of those units for logging NOAA broadcasts. The unit had been running that feature all night, at 2:17 a.m., 12 minutes after Raymond said the lines were gone, 3 minutes before I lost him on Channel 19 entirely. The recorder picked up something. The DCI audio technician described it in his notes as non-standard radio interference, possible voice component, origin unidentified. 11 seconds, not Raymond's voice, not a voice that could be matched to any driver logged on that stretch that night. A sound in the frequency range of human speech that arrived on Raymond's channel lasted 11 seconds and stopped. The technician wrote that he could not rule out atmospheric skip. He also wrote that he could not confirm it. Raymond's daughter drives the same corridor now, works for a carrier out of Denver, runs I-80 because she told me once she's not going to let a road own her. I've seen her at the Petro off exit 235 a couple of times, and we talk until we run out of things to say that aren't about him, and then we stop talking and drink our coffee and watch the lot fill and empty, in the dark. I run that stretch 2-3 times a month. I still turn the squelch down between Rawlins and Laramie without deciding to. Not because I'm waiting for something. The channel is always empty on that stretch. Every time it's empty, I think about 11 seconds of something that couldn't be identified, couldn't be explained, and couldn't be ruled out. And I think about whether empty is the answer, or just another version of the question. I still have the photo on my phone. Not the ones from our anniversary or the kids' birthdays or the trip we took to Gulf Shores the summer before. I mean the photo Dennis sent me at 12:21 in the morning on the night he disappeared. A picture of his GPS screen, taken with one hand while he was driving, blurry at the edges, the cab light catching the glare. He sent it without a message, just the photo, and what it showed was a road being drawn on the screen that did not correspond to any road I could find on any map afterward. a line going south from US 90 straight into a section of the Atchafalaya Basin that, according to every source I've checked, has no paved access. No parish road, no service road, no logging route. Just water and cypress and the kind of dark that doesn't have a bottom. The GPS was routing him there like it was a real destination, like something was waiting at the end of it. I keep that photo because I'm afraid of what it means that it exists, and I'm more afraid of what it means if I delete it. Dennis drove for a living the way some men fish or hunt, not because it paid well, though it paid well enough, but because it was the one place where his particular kind of restlessness made sense. He was not a man who sat. He was not a man who waited. In 14 years of marriage, I watched him eat standing up at the kitchen counter more times than I can count. Not because there was no chair, but because sitting down felt to him like conceding something. On the road, that quality became useful. He could push hours that wore other drivers down. He had a saying about it, something about the truck not knowing what time it is, so why should he? I used to think that was funny. I think about it differently now. The night it happened, he was running US 90 eastbound, industrial pipe fittings out of a depot near Lake Charles, delivery to a yard outside of New Orleans, a route he'd driven 50 times if he'd driven it once. He called me at 11:40 from the pilot outside Morgan City, said he was going to push through to Lafayette before stopping for the night. I told him the weather radio had been talking about fog off the Atchafalaya all evening, the kind that comes in off the basin in October and sits on US 90 like something poured from a jar, thick enough that your headlights just bounce back at you and the road disappears 30 feet out. He said he knew the fog. He said he'd be careful. I said okay. Those are the last words I said to him that felt normal. I've driven that stretch of US 90 since in the daytime just to understand it. The highway runs on elevated causeway sections over parts of the basin, and when the Atchafalaya fog comes in, it doesn't behave the way fog behaves. In other places, it doesn't thin as you drive. It moves with you, or it seems to, and the cypress trees you can sometimes see from the road in daylight disappear entirely, and the world shrinks to whatever the headlights can hold, which in that kind of fog is not very far at all. I wanted to understand what he was driving through that night. I went out there and stood on the shoulder and looked at it. I don't think I came home understanding anything. He called again at 12:18. Just, hey. That was the whole greeting, the way he always called when he wasn't calling about anything specific, just checking in, just wanting the sound of the house. I said hey back and waited. He was quiet for a few seconds, then said it was a weird night. I asked what he meant. He said the GPS had been pulling him south for the past 40 minutes, not suggesting a route south, actively routing him, recalculating every time he ignored it, drawing a line off US 90 down toward the basin like that was where he was supposed to go. He'd reset it twice and it had recalculated to the same road both times. That's when he took the photo and sent it to me. I told him to shut the GPS off and use the highway signs, that old units sometimes corrupted their map data, that it wasn't worth arguing with a machine at midnight. He said, yeah, that was probably it. He said the fog was getting thick. He said he'd call me from Lafayette. He did not call from Lafayette. The third call came at 1:03 in the morning. I know the exact time because I looked at my phone screen when it rang, and the numbers are as clear in my memory as anything I've ever seen. I was half asleep, but I answered on the second ring because I always answered when Dennis called on a run. The line connected and he didn't say anything. I said his name. I said it twice. I could hear the truck, the engine note I'd learned over years, that specific frequency the cab held at highway speed. And then I heard road noise drop, the way it does when you slow down or pull over. I want to be specific about this because for 20 years people have let me say a sound I can't describe and moved on, and I'm tired of that. I can describe it. I've described it to myself every night since. It was a mechanical sound, not the truck, not the engine, not anything that belongs inside a cab. It was the sound of something being operated, something with moving parts, something that required deliberate action, like a latch being worked or a lever being thrown, not fast, considered, the sound of a mechanism doing exactly what it was built to do. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, and then the call went silent, and then the call dropped. Not cut off, not a crash noise. The call dropped the way calls drop when a phone is powered off. Louisiana State Police found his truck at 6:15 the next morning. A man who traps crawfish in that stretch of the basin drives a particular parish road before dawn to reach his traps, and he saw the rig pulled into a gravel turnout off that road, about 2 miles south of US 90, on a road that goes nowhere except toward the water. The truck was facing south. The engine was off. The door was closed. His phone was on the passenger seat. His logbook was open on the dash to the page for that night, with his Morgan City check-in logged and nothing written after it. The load of pipe fittings was untouched. The parish road Dennis had turned onto was not on his route. It was not on any detour. There was no reported accident or road closure on US 90 that night that would have sent him south. No reason for that truck to be 2 miles off the highway on a gravel road in the Atchafalaya Basin at 1 in the morning. No reason except that something had been gnawing him to go there for 40 minutes, and at some point between 12:18 and 1:03, he had apparently decided to listen. State police worked the area for 4 days before they called in dive teams for the adjacent waterways. 8 days total. 2 sections of bayou dragged, 1 stretch of a drainage channel that runs parallel to the parish road and empties into the basin about a quarter-mile south of where the truck was found. They found 1 boot, his size, a 12 wide, a size most stores only carry 1 or 2 pairs of in stock, which is why Dennis always bought the same brand when he found something that fit. Lace-up work boot, brown. The laces tied in the double knot he did at the ankle because his feet were wide enough that a single knot would loosen inside an hour of walking. I identified the boot from a photograph the detective sent because he had the sense not to make me come in for that. I recognized the double knot first before I even looked at the size or the brand. I recognized the way he tied his shoes. No foot inside it. The boot was found lace-up, tied, empty, not floating, weighted down in the silt at the bottom of the channel. The way something goes down when it goes down with something in it and the something isn't there anymore. The investigation ran for 11 months before it went quiet in any practical sense, though nobody used that word to my face. The lead detective, a man who'd worked missing persons in that parish for 18 years, told me once that the case bothered him in a way he couldn't put into language. I told him I understood that. I did not tell him about the sound on the phone. I don't know why. I think I was afraid that saying it out loud to an official person would make it into a fact I couldn't take back. He retired in the spring of 2019, called me 2 weeks before his last day. He said he thought about the boot more than he thought about most things from his career. He said the boot in the silt, tied that way, bothered him more than the rest of it because it implied a sequence of events he couldn't reconstruct. I told him about the sound. First time I told anyone with any specificity. The mechanical sound. The 3 seconds. The way the call ended after it. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, and I'm going to remember this exact phrasing until I die, he said, that changes the shape of it. He didn't say how. He retired 2 weeks later. I haven't spoken to him since. I still have Dennis in my contacts under the name I put him in before we were married, before any of this. I haven't changed it. Not because I think he'll call. I know he won't call. I haven't changed it because changing it would be deciding something I'm not ready to decide. And nobody gets to tell me when I have to be ready. The photo of the GPS is still there too. That road going south into the basin. I zoom in sometimes looking for a label, a name, anything the map might have assigned to wherever that line was taking him. There's never anything. Just the line, and the dark, and the water at the end of it. The truck is still out there somewhere. Not the wreck of it, not the shell. The whole rig, engine intact, load untouched, sitting on a shoulder in the New Mexico dark like it was waiting for a driver who stepped away for a moment and never stepped back. That is not a figure of speech. That is the case file. He was 58 years old, and he had been driving long haul for 31 years, and in 31 years he had never once been late. Not a missed delivery, not a reroute he hadn't called in, not a single gap in the chain between pickup and drop that he couldn't account for to the minute. The dispatch office kept his on-time record in a folder, a literal folder, paper, because he'd started before the digital logs, and nobody had ever bothered to move the record over because there was never a reason to look at it. You don't audit a thing that has never failed. His name doesn't matter here. What matters is what he was, and what he was a man who understood that a load is a contract. That was the word he used, contract. Not a job, not a run, not a delivery. A contract between the person who needed something moved and the person doing the moving, and you don't break a contract because the weather got bad, or the night got long, or your back was bothering you somewhere around hour 9. You honor it or you don't drive. He was repositioning an empty flatbed from Albuquerque back to Amarillo on a Tuesday night in late autumn. Eastbound on I-40, no cargo, Nothing in the trailer but air and highway noise. A reposition run is the kind of driving that either relaxes you or makes you careless, depending on the driver. For him, it was the former. He'd told dispatch he expected to roll into Amarillo before 2 a.m. He would fuel at the Flying J in Santa Rosa, 90 miles east of where he'd picked up the empty flat in Albuquerque. Routine, logged, expected. The dispatcher, a woman who had worked with him for 11 years, told investigators later that she could set her watch by his check-ins. Not almost. Exactly. She said she would glance at the clock sometimes when she heard his voice on the radio, and it would be within 45 seconds of when she expected him. Every time, for 11 years, he checked in at 8:47 p.m. from Moriarty, New Mexico, eastbound, moving, right on schedule. Now here is the thing nobody outside of the investigation knows, or at least nobody talks about when they talk about this case, which they don't, because a missing trucker on a reposition run in New Mexico does not make national news. It makes a state police report, and a family's kitchen table, and eventually a cold case number that gets cross-referenced with nothing, because there is nothing to cross-reference it with. The dispatcher was monitoring his GPS unit, a Qualcomm tracker mounted on his dash, the little blue dot on her screen that told her where every truck in the fleet was at any given moment. She watched the dot move east from Moriarty. Steady, normal. The speed was consistent, no braking events, no hard turns. Just a man driving east through the desert on a night that was cold and clear and utterly unremarkable. At approximately 9:40, the dot stopped. She wasn't alarmed immediately. She'd seen him stop before on this stretch, and she knew about the heart thing. Not officially, because he'd never disclosed it on his medical certification. But she'd noticed over the years, the way you notice things about a person when you've been talking to them across a radio for a decade. The 20-minute pauses in the middle of nowhere. She never asked. He never explained. They had an understanding that some things don't need to be said out loud. She gave it 30 minutes. She sent a Qualcomm ping at 10:15. The unit didn't respond. She called his cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His voice recorded years ago, saying to leave a message and he'd get back to you. She called the Flying J in Santa Rosa. He had not arrived. She called twice more over the next 40 minutes. Both times, voicemail. She called state police at 11 p.m. They found the truck on the shoulder near the Route 3 overpass, 4 miles east of Moriarty. Engine off, cab locked from the outside. His wallet in the center console, untouched, with $340 in it, and every card he owned. His phone was not in the truck, and it has never been recovered. The Qualcomm unit, and this is the detail that ended up in the state police report, and was never satisfactorily explained, had been physically disconnected from the dash. Not ripped out, not damaged, unplugged deliberately, each connector separated cleanly, the way a person who knew what they were doing would do it. The bracket it mounted in was still bolted to the dash. The wires were folded back neatly. Someone had taken the time. 13 missed calls on his personal phone, all from dispatch, all after 9:40. The cab was clean. His logbook was open to that day's entry, completed up through the Moriarty check-in. The pen was on the passenger seat. His thermos was in the cup holder, cold. He'd drunk the last of the coffee sometime before he stopped. And then the receipt. If you have been following this case at the document level, you know about the receipt. If you haven't, here is what it is. A Love's travel stop fuel receipt, timestamped 9:22 p.m. for a transaction made at the Love's in Tucumcari, New Mexico, 61 miles east of where his truck was parked, his fleet card number, his truck's fuel amount, the exact quantity that would fill his tanks from the level they'd been at when he left Albuquerque. The transaction cleared. The bank confirmed it. It was not a pending charge, not a glitch, not a card skimmer that ran the number remotely. It was a completed fuel purchase at a pump in Tucumcari at 9:22 p.m. His truck's GPS dot stopped moving at approximately 9:40, 18 minutes after he supposedly fueled 61 miles east of where he stopped. You can try to make that work mathematically. People have. If his truck was somehow at the Love's in Tucumcari at 9:22, he would have needed to average over 200 miles per hour to be back at the Route 3 overpass by 9:40. I-40 is a federal interstate in New Mexico with a posted limit of 75. There are cameras. There are weigh stations. Nobody flagged a truck moving at impossible speeds. Nobody saw him. The Love's in Tucumcari had no camera footage of his rig. The pump the transaction processed at was an exterior diesel pump, no overhead canopy camera, which is not unusual for older travel stops that haven't been retrofitted. The fuel desk attendant on duty that night was interviewed 3 days after the disappearance. She did not remember a flatbed. She said Tuesday nights were slow. She would have noticed an empty flat because they were unusual at that location, which ran mostly loaded long haul. She didn't notice one. The bank statement shows the charge. The pump shows the transaction. The truck was 4 miles east of Moriarty. Investigators looked at every possible explanation. Card cloning at a previous fuel stop. A ghost transaction generated by a billing system error. A second driver using a duplicated fleet card. Every theory collapsed against the same wall. The transaction is real. It cleared. The bank has no mechanism to explain it as an error. And the fleet card was in his name on a truck that was 61 miles away. His son, who also drives, who has been driving for 9 years, who runs a variation of this same route sometimes, said something in an interview that stayed with investigators long after the case went cold. He said his father would never have stopped on that shoulder without a reason. Not on a clear night, not on a road he knew, not on an empty flat. He said his father treated a stop without a reason as a failure of planning, and his father did not fail to plan. The wallet in the console, the logbook open, the pen on the seat. His son said that looked like a man who expected to come back to the cab, like a man who stepped out for 30 seconds to check a tire or look at something on the road shoulder. He said the GPS disconnect was what he couldn't account for. His father knew how to unplug a Qualcomm unit. Every long-haul driver of that generation did. You learned it because the units sometimes malfunctioned, and you had to know how to reset them. It wasn't complicated. But why would you unplug it on a dark shoulder in New Mexico at 9:40 on a Tuesday night, unless you didn't want to be tracked? And if you didn't want to be tracked, why leave your wallet? Why leave the logbook open? Why leave everything that mattered sitting on the seat like you were coming back in a minute? The son said he thinks about the turn. His father didn't make more than he thinks about the receipt. He thinks about the fact that his father knew I-40 like the lines on his own hand, and his truck was found on the shoulder of a road he had driven 100 times. And there is no explanation for why it stopped there that holds together past the first question anyone asks. The receipt exists. The timestamp is real. The transaction cleared 61 miles away, 18 minutes before the dot stopped. Nobody has ever explained it. The dispatcher retired in 2019. She said in her last week on the job that she still thought about the ping she sent at 10:15, the one that went unanswered. She said she'd spent 8 years trying to figure out whether there was something she should have done differently in those 30 minutes she waited. Whether if she'd called sooner or called the state police instead of the Flying J, something would have changed. The cold case unit reviewed the file twice. Both times they put it back in the drawer. The Loves in Tucumcari is still there. The pump is still there. On clear nights in autumn, when the desert goes flat and cold, and the semis run east on I-40 with their running lights. Cutting the dark, somebody fueled a truck at that pump at 9:22 p.m. on a Tuesday in November. The truck was 61 miles away. 31 years. Not a single late delivery. Not one missed check-in, not one load that arrived at the wrong dock. Not one call to dispatch that said, "I'm running behind, give them a heads up." 31 years of a man doing the same thing with the same precision and the same quiet pride. And then one night in February in Montana, in 9-degree cold, he turned south. That's the whole story in one sentence. He turned south. And everything that makes it impossible to close, everything that makes it the kind of case that sits in a cold file drawer and gets pulled out and looked at and put back again without resolution. All of it comes down to that one turn. Not a crash, not a medical event on the highway, not a breakdown, not a hijacking, not a wrong exit taken in bad weather. A deliberate turn onto a road he had no reason to be on, at a time when he was running on schedule toward a delivery he had every intention of completing. The people who knew him will tell you, before they tell you anything else, that the turn is the part that doesn't fit, not the boot prints which everyone asks about. The turn. He had been driving long haul for 3 decades. He started when the logbooks were paper and the CB was your only connection to anyone between towns. And he was still driving when the digital tracking units went in, and the satellite phones became standard, and the trucking industry started to feel less like a profession and more like a monitored system. He adapted to all of it without complaint because none of it changed the fundamental thing, which was that a load was a promise and a promise was kept. That was the ethic he operated by, and, from what people who knew him say, the ethic he tried to pass to his son, who also drives. His son will tell you that his father had every on-time confirmation he'd ever received, printed, dated, filed, in a binder in his home office, not for bragging, for record. His father believed that a record of reliability was the only professional legacy that meant anything in a trade, mate, where nobody knew your name except the dock workers and the dispatch team and the other drivers who heard your voice on Channel 19. He had been invisible to the world for 31 years, and he had been exactly on time for all of it. And that was enough for him. He was hauling combine parts from Minot, North Dakota to Whitefish, Montana in the first week of February 2007, US 2 westbound, the High Line, as the drivers call it, the long flat run across the northern edge of the state that turns brutal in winter and stays brutal until sometime in April, when it decides to be merely difficult. The high temperature that week was 9 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no storm system moving through, no ice warning on the radio, no weather event that would have justified a reroute, just cold. The kind of cold that has been on that road every winter for as long as there has been a road, and that he had driven through a dozen times on this exact route. He knew US 2. That matters. He didn't know it the way a driver knows a road they've run twice or 5 times. He knew it the way you know something you have committed to memory because you respected it enough to study it. He knew which sections drifted in a northwest wind. He knew which motels kept a room unlocked for truckers when the road went bad. He knew the grades, the curves, the mile markers, the fuel stops, the spots where the shoulder narrowed without warning. His son says he could have described any 10-mile stretch of the High Line in the dark from memory and been accurate down to the landmarks. He was on schedule. That is confirmed. His last communication with dispatch placed him on US 2 moving west, right where he was supposed to be, right when he was supposed to be there. Nothing in the communication suggested anything wrong. He sounded, by the dispatcher's account, the way he always sounded, even unhurried, already thinking ahead to the next check-in point, the way a man thinks ahead when the route is familiar and the load is secure. Then he turned south, 7 miles south of Malta, Montana, a county road unnamed on most maps, maintained by the county but narrow, 1 lane of actual pavement with gravel shoulders that disappear in snow. The road leads into the Missouri River breaks, which is a landscape of steep coulees and frozen creek beds and winter bare cottonwoods and essentially nothing else. No towns, no structures of significance, no reason for a loaded semi hauling combine parts to be anywhere near it. This is not a road you take by accident. That is not an opinion. It is a geographic fact that the investigators confirmed, and that his son confirmed, and that anyone who has driven that stretch of US 2 will confirm. The turnoff does not resemble an interchange. There are no signs that would mislead a driver. There is no configuration of the intersection that would cause a person paying attention to mistake it for a westbound continuation of the highway. You have to make the decision to turn. You have to mean it. There were no detour signs, no accident or road closure ahead of him that any agency could document. The highway was open. The weather was cold but not impassable. He had no reason, logged or otherwise, to leave US 2. The truck was found at the end of the county road, in a gravel pull-off at the edge of the breaks where the road stopped being a road and became a 2-track that disappeared into the coulees. The load was intact. The keys were in the ignition, the engine was off. His CB, his thermos, his overnight bag, everything was in the cab, in its place, exactly as it would be if he had simply parked and stepped outside for a moment. In the snow around the driver's door, 1 set of boot prints, his size, his tread, confirmed later against his spare pair. The prints came from the cab, moved 8 feet into the field, and stopped. Not faded, not covered by drifting snow, because there was no wind that night to speak of, which the meteorological record confirmed. Not obscured by a second set of tracks, because there was no second set of tracks. The prints went 8 feet from the truck and ended as cleanly as if someone had drawn a line in the snow at that point and said, "This is where it stops." No scuff marks indicating a fall. No sign of a struggle, no drag marks, no disturbance in the snow beyond those 8 prints. They stopped, and beyond them the field was smooth and unbroken all the way to the coulee edge. Search and rescue worked the breaks for a week. The Missouri River had ice on it, and they cut sections to look beneath. They used dogs, which followed the bootprint trail to where it ended, and then sat down, which handlers said meant the scent simply stopped at that point. Not that it went in a different direction. Not that it dissipated over distance. It stopped. At the same place the prints stopped. The temperature that night dropped to 11 below zero. A man on foot in that terrain in February in that cold, without shelter. The search coordinator told the family privately that survivability past a few hours was essentially zero. They searched anyway. They found nothing. Now here is the thing that lives in his son's head. The thing that the boot prints and the cold and the impossible trail have not managed to displace, because the boot prints are strange, but they are at least a physical fact. Something you can put in a report and look at and say, yes, this happened. Here is the evidence. What his son cannot file away is this. His father had driven US 2 westbound 12 times, 12 documented trips on the High Line between Minot and Whitefish. His son looked up every one of them after the disappearance, went through the old paper logs, the dispatch records, everything he could find. 12 trips, all of them west on US 2, all of them on time, all of them without a single deviation logged, reported, or suggested by anyone who tracked those runs. Not once in 12 trips on that road had his father gone south of Malta. Not once had he taken that county road, or any county road in that stretch, or deviated from his route by so much as an exit. His son knows this because the record says so, and because he knew his father, and his father was not a man who wandered. Wandering was, in the most fundamental sense, the opposite of what he was. So the question his son comes back to, the one he has been sitting with for 18 years, is not how the boot prints stopped. It is why the truck turned south in the first place. Because the boot prints are an anomaly at the end of the story, but the turn is the anomaly that made everything else possible. Something caused a 31-year veteran of that specific highway to leave the highway he knew better than almost any road on earth and drive 7 miles south into the Missouri River breaks on a 9-degree February night with a full load of combine parts and no explanation logged anywhere. His son has driven US 2 since. He has passed the turnoff. He has slowed down when he passed it and looked south down the county road to where it disappears into the breaks, and tried to see whatever his father saw that made the turn feel like the right thing to do. He says he can't see it. He says he's stopped trying to understand the boot prints, because the boot prints are the end of something that was already in motion before the truck ever left the highway. He says the turn is where the real question is. The boot prints are just where the question ran out of road. 11 below that night. Unbroken snow, 8 prints, then nothing. He turned south, and no one has ever been able to say why. The man who answered the phone was not his brother. He knew it before the first sentence was finished. Not because the voice was wrong. It wasn't. Exactly. It was close enough to be unsettling, but because of what the voice did not do. His brother always answered a callback with a reason. Sorry, was stretching. Had to check the tire. Couldn't find the phone. 15 years of callbacks, 15 years of his brother filling the first 5 seconds with something, a word, a sound, an explanation that was already coming out before the phone was fully at his ear. That was the rhythm. That was the pattern. The man who picked up that phone in Tift County, Georgia at midnight said nothing for 2 full seconds, and in those 2 seconds, before a single word was spoken, something shifted in the air of that conversation that never shifted back. He had been driving long haul for 15 years when his brother disappeared. They had gotten their CDLs within 4 months of each other. Him first, then his brother, who had followed him into the trade the way younger brothers follow older ones into things, not because they were told to, but because they saw something in it worth wanting. They ran different routes, different carriers, different freight, but they kept each other company the way people do when they've grown up in the same house and learned the same silences, and can read the shape of a conversation from the first word. His wife used to say they talked more than people who lived together. She said it like a gentle complaint, and he took it as a compliment because she was right, and he knew she was right, and he had never been ashamed of it. 15 years of long-haul driving means 15 years of nights when the road is the only thing, and the voice on the other end of the phone is the only human contact between one rest stop and the next. It means you learn the other person's voice the way you learn a road you drive often, not just the sound of it, but the rhythm of it, the way it moves through a sentence, the specific weight it puts on certain words, the tells that come out when something is wrong or something is funny, or the miles are getting long. He knew his brother's voice at a level below conscious recognition. It was pattern recognition built over decades, which is why, when the man on the other end said, he stepped out, he'll be right back, in a voice that was almost right but not quite, the wrongness landed not in his head but somewhere lower, somewhere that doesn't wait for the brain to catch up. His brother had called him from a rest area near Tifton, Georgia, around 11:30 that night. Southbound on I-75, hauling sealed retail pallets, running a Thursday night load that he'd done variations of for 3 years. He said he was pulling in to stretch his legs, said he'd call back in 10 minutes. That was normal. That was exactly the kind of thing he said. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 25. He called back. A man answered, calm, unhurried. No background noise that you wouldn't expect. Road ambience, faint hum of something electrical. The kind of ambient sound a truck cab produces when the engine is idling. Nothing alarming in the audio environment. Just the voice, and the 2-second pause, and then the words delivered in a register that was measured in a way that real calm is not. Real calm is loose. This was controlled. There is a difference, and he had spent enough time on the road, enough nights talking to enough people through enough situations, to know the difference without being able to articulate it in a way that would satisfy a detective writing it into a report. He asked who it was. The man said, a friend, not a buddy of his or a name or an explanation. Just a friend, like the category was sufficient, like the word was meant to close the question rather than answer it. The call ended normally. That is the detail he has returned to more times than he can count in the 10 years since. Not a hang-up, not a dropped connection. A normal termination. The kind that happens when someone presses the button deliberately. The kind that happens when the conversation is finished and the person ending it has decided it's finished. He sat in his cab on the northbound side of I-75 and looked at the screen of his phone and felt something that he has described in different ways to different people over the years, wrong, hollow, certain, and called back immediately. No answer. Voicemail. His brother's voice on the recorded greeting, the real one, the one he'd set up years ago, unhurried and familiar. He called Georgia State Patrol at 12:47 a.m. The truck was at the rest stop, parked in a standard semi-bay, backed in the way his brother always backed in, squared up, even spacing on both sides, the way a driver parks when they've been doing it long enough that it's automatic. The sealed load was untouched. Every pallet where it was supposed to be, the seals unbroken, the inventory intact. His brother's phone was on the passenger seat, face up, not thrown, not dropped, placed. His jacket was on the back of the sleeper berth. His logbook was open. His reading glasses were on the dash. Nothing in the cab suggested a struggle. Nothing suggested he'd left in a hurry. It looked, the first officer on scene said in his report, like a man who had stepped out to use the facilities and would be back in 2 minutes. He was not back in 2 minutes. He has not been back in 10 years. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation ran the case for 4 months. They pulled phone records, tower data, the call log from that night. They confirmed the call he'd received, the timestamp, the duration, the number it came from, which was his brother's number from his brother's phone, which was found on the passenger seat of a truck parked at the rest stop, meaning someone had used his brother's phone to answer that call, meaning someone had been in the cab or had the phone at 12:03 a.m. when he called back, meaning the man who said a friend was in physical possession of his brother's phone within minutes of whatever happened in that rest area. The GBI cleared a man from Valdosta, Georgia, early in the investigation. He had a prior connected to cargo theft. His number was in the call history from a different night, and he had no verifiable alibi for the night in question. They cleared him anyway. On evidence the file doesn't fully specify. After that, the investigation ran another 2 months and produced nothing that led anywhere. The sealed retail load was the thing investigators kept returning to. Nothing in those pallets on the manifest suggested a target worth the risk of what happened. Consumer goods, mid-range, the kind of freight that moves on I-75 100 times a week. Not electronics, not pharmaceuticals, not anything with a street value that would explain the level of planning that a thing like this requires. Because here is what a thing like this requires. You need to know the route, know the rest stop, know the timing, know which truck you're watching and when it's going to pull in. You need to be at the location before the driver arrives or arrive within a window, tight enough that you don't risk exposure. You need to be calm enough, after whatever happened, to pick up a ringing phone and hold a conversation without alarming the person on the other end. That last part, that is the part that has never left him. Because the man who answered his brother's phone was not panicked, was not rushed, was not doing the thing a person does when they're in the middle of something they didn't plan for, and a phone rings and they make a snap decision to answer it. He was settled. He had the answer ready before the question was fully asked. He said a friend. The way you say something you've already decided to say. not the way you say something you're making up under pressure. He knew the phone was going to ring. He had decided what to say when it did. That is the conclusion he came to about 6 months after the disappearance, and has not been able to move away from since. The man who answered that phone had accounted for him, had known there was a brother who would call back, had known the call was coming, had prepared for it. Which means whoever planned what happened on the southbound shoulder of I-75 in Tift County at midnight on a Thursday had done enough research to know that his brother was the kind of man who stayed in contact, who called back when he said he would call back, whose disappearance would be noticed quickly by someone who knew his voice well enough to notice. And they answered anyway. They picked up the phone, knowing he was on the other end and knowing what he would ask, and they said 2 words and ended the call. He has spent 10 years asking what those 2 words meant, not as a figure of speech, literally asking. Asking investigators, asking people who have worked cargo theft cases, asking truckers who have driven that corridor and know the rest stops and the patterns of who watches which routes and why. He has asked people who study how criminal organizations communicate and what kind of shorthand they use internally, and whether a friend means something specific in any context he hasn't encountered yet. Nobody has given him an answer that goes all the way to the bottom of the question. What he knows is this: his brother would have said something in the first 2 seconds. Would have filled the silence with something real. Something that sounded like him. Something that carried the specific weight of a voice he'd been listening to for 30-some years. The man who answered did not do that. The man who answered let the silence sit there and then filled it with words that were chosen rather than natural. A friend. His brother did not have friends on the shoulder of I-75 in Tift County at midnight. He had a brother 40 miles north, on the other side of a phone line, who knew the difference. That is the only thing he is certain of. 10 years later, that certainty has not moved. The tape still exists. That is the first thing you need to understand before anything else about this case makes sense or fails to make sense, which it will. Fail, that is, spectacularly and completely, the way certain things fail when you hold them up to ordinary logic, and ordinary logic just looks back at you and shrugs. The tape exists. It has been in an evidence folder since the week of the disappearance, and on it is a voice that 2 separate audio analysts have confirmed belongs to a man who was not in his truck at the time the voice was recorded. That is not an interpretation. That is not a family member's grief distorting what they heard. That is a documented fact sitting in a folder in a South Dakota law enforcement archive, and it has been sitting there for over 20 years without a satisfactory explanation attached to it. He drove feed deliveries out of Pierre. That was the job: bagged livestock feed, agricultural supply routes, the kind of long-haul work that isn't glamorous and doesn't pretend to be. US 83 south through the Central Plains, the same corridor 3 and sometimes 4 times a week, regular enough that the landscape stopped being scenery and became something closer to a clock. The mile markers, the fence lines, the specific way the horizon sat at different times of day. All of it became a kind of timekeeping for a man who had been running that road long, enough to stop seeing it consciously and start feeling it instead. The way you feel a familiar route in your hands and your body before your eyes have fully registered where you are. He had a habit that the neighbor described as almost involuntary. He would call out mile markers to himself, not into the CB, not into any recording, just out loud in the cab, a private accounting that had developed over years of running the same road, until it had become something he did without deciding to do it. The neighbor, a retired rancher who lived about a quarter mile off US 83 and had been monitoring CB Channel 19 as company for 15 years, the way people in isolated places find company in the ambient frequency of passing human activity, had noticed this habit through the squelch bleed. When the CB's noise gate was open and a nearby radio was transmitting even idly, you could sometimes catch sounds from the cab that weren't meant for the channel. The mile marker calls came through that way. Not clearly, not every time, but enough that the neighbor had noticed the pattern and come to expect it. Marker 194, then 201, then 208. Regular as a clock, the neighbor said. And that comparison, regular as a clock, is the one that makes what happened next carry the weight it carries. Because what the neighbor described was not just a routine. It was a man who had become so calibrated to that road that his presence on it was predictable to someone who had never met him and, had only heard fragments of his voice through a radio receiver in a ranch house set back from the highway. That October night he came through at 194 right on schedule. Then 201. Then 2008. Neighbor caught a word or two at 208. Something indistinct. And then silence. Waiting for 215. 215 did not come. Now here is where you need to hold two things at once, because the temptation is to reach for an explanation before you've fully sat with what the neighbor experienced in that hour of waiting. He waited. He tried raising the driver on channel 19, which he had done before on other nights when a driver seemed to be having trouble, not because he was dispatching or monitoring professionally, but because 15 years of listening to a corridor makes you feel a responsibility to it that has no official name. He keyed up and called. He waited for a response. A voice came back on channel 19. The neighbor has described this moment in the same way every time he has been asked to describe it, across 3 separate interviews over the years, and the consistency of the description is either the mark of a truthful account or the mark of a story that is calcified through repetition into something that can no longer be adjusted. Investigators tend to view that consistency as the former. The voice that came back was the driver's voice. Not similar, not in the same general register. His voice, exactly, the specific way he clipped the ends of words, the slight flatness in the vowels that was regional and personal at the same time, the cadence that the neighbor had been absorbing through the squelch bleed for 3 years of weekly passes. What the voice said was, already past it, 3 words. Then the channel went quiet and stayed quiet. The neighbor sat with that for a long time before he called anyone. He has said in interviews that he wasn't sure what he'd heard, which is a reasonable thing to say and probably true, and also that he was sure it was the voice he recognized, which is a contradictory thing to say and probably also true, in the way that human perception can hold 2 incompatible certainties at once, when what it has encountered does not fit any existing category. He had heard that voice dozens of times through the squelch bleed. He had never heard it respond directly to a channel 19 call, because the driver had never keyed up in his presence in 3 years of monitored runs. The voice had always been ambient, always involuntary, always the private sound of a man talking to himself in a moving cab, and now it had answered him, directly, on channel 19, 3 words, in that voice, and then nothing. The truck was found the next morning between markers 208 and 215, parked half on the shoulder with the engine off. The load was untouched. Bagged livestock feed, stacked and secured, nothing disturbed. The temperature had been in the mid-20s overnight. No towns within 6 miles, no structures, no lights. The kind of darkness that the Central Plains produce on a moonless October night that people who have not been in it tend to underestimate. Not just the absence of light, but the presence of something that the absence makes room for. A quality of isolation that is physical and environmental, and that the plains can sustain for miles in every direction without interruption. He was not there. The cab was empty. The highway patrol treated it initially as a medical event. A driver who had pulled over feeling unwell and wandered from the vehicle in a disoriented state, which happens, which is a documented phenomenon, and which fit the physical facts of the scene except for the temperature and the distance from any shelter, and the total absence of any trace beyond the vehicle itself. He was 44 years old. His DOT physical 3 weeks before the disappearance had come back clean. No cardiac flags, no neurological concerns, no documentation of any condition that would have predicted a medical event on a cold October night on a road he had driven hundreds of times. The search lasted 4 days. The terrain around US 83 in that section is grassland and shallow draws, not the kind of landscape that swallows a person without leaving something behind. They found nothing but the tape. The neighbor had been logging weather patterns for years using a tape deck connected to his CB and receiver, a habit from an earlier period of his life, when he tracked precipitation and wind events for his own agricultural records, a habit he had maintained past its usefulness simply because it had become routine. The tape that night was running. The investigators took it in the first week. The recording contains the ambient traffic of Channel 19 for the relevant hours, including the mile marker calls at 194 and 201, partially audible through the squelch bleed, and then silence through the 208 window, where the neighbor heard something indistinct. And then the call the neighbor made on Channel 19, his voice asking if anyone was out there on the 83 corridor, and then the response. The audio analysts who reviewed the tape confirmed 3 things. First, that the voice responding on channel 19 matched the vocal characteristics of the recordings taken from the driver's dispatch communications. The same person, to a reasonable degree of professional certainty. Second, that the recording showed no signs of splicing, dubbing, or post-production alteration that would indicate the response had been inserted into the tape rather than recorded live. Third, that the timestamp on the recording placed the Channel 19 response at a point in the evening when the driver's truck, based on its found location and the fuel and mileage records, would have been between markers 2:08 and 2:15, parked, engine off, empty. Empty, as in, no driver. The voice on the tape came from a radio in a truck that had no one in it. Or it came from somewhere else on the channel, from another radio, another transmitter, another source that happened to produce a voice with the same vocal characteristics at the same moment the neighbor called. That is the alternative explanation, and it is the one that the investigators formally recorded as unresolved, because unresolved is where the case lives and has always lived, in the space between what the tape says and what physics allows. Already past it. The neighbor asked everyone he could find what those 3 words might mean. Past what? Past the mile marker he'd missed. Past some point on the road that only the driver knew. Past something else entirely. Something that the 3 words are pointing toward, in a direction that ordinary language can't quite reach. No one has ever given him an answer that closes the question. What he has instead is the tape, which still exists, in an evidence folder, in an archive in South Dakota, with a voice on it that belongs to a man who was not in his truck when the voice was recorded. He replays it in his memory on nights when US 83 is quiet and the channel is open, and the squelch bleed brings him the ambient sound of trucks, passing in the dark regular as a clock, marker by marker, heading south toward a stretch of road that swallowed a man on a cold October night, gave back nothing except 3 words on a frequency that shouldn't have been able to carry them. Already past it. Past what? Exactly, nobody knows. But the tape knows, and the tape isn't talking. The clearance was 18 inches, on each side, in the dark, through a gravel entrance that isn't marked on any GPS map, into a private lot between 2 pieces of farm equipment that had been sitting in those positions since the dealership closed for the season. 18 inches of space on each side of a 48-foot refrigerated trailer, backed in cleanly, the refrigeration unit still running, the dairy load cold and intact and perfectly preserved, as if the driver had simply stepped away to handle something and would be back momentarily to finish the job. She was not back momentarily. She has not been back at all. Her younger sister drives the same route now for the same company, and she has passed through Kinsley, Kansas at night more times than she can count in the 2 years since she took over the run. Every time she passes the entrance to that lot, she slows down. Not to look for something. There is nothing left to find. The investigators went over that ground thoroughly and found nothing that answered anything. But because of the math. Because she was taught to back a rig by the same person who backed a 48-foot trailer into that space in the dark. Off a road, she had no reason to leave, and she knows what the math says about what that parking job required. And she cannot reconcile what the math says with any explanation that has been offered for why it happened. 18 inches. She has been driving for 2 years. She is good at it. Her sister made sure of that, spent hours on dock approaches with her, stood outside in the yard calling corrections until the backing became instinct rather than calculation. And she will tell you plainly that she could not have put that trailer in that space in the dark off an unfamiliar entrance in 1 pass, maybe not in 3 passes. The entrance was unpaved, the lot was unlit, the equipment on both sides was irregular in shape and sitting at slight angles to each other that made the effective clearance asymmetric in ways that only matter when you're the one looking in the mirrors. Her sister could have done it. That is the conclusion she keeps arriving at. Her sister was the kind of driver who treated precision as a form of respect, for the load, for the dock workers, for the equipment, for the road itself. She had patience for a backing approach that most drivers didn't have, not because she was slow, but because she understood that doing something correctly the first time was faster in the long run than doing it, approximately, and adjusting. She could hold a line through a complicated approach the way a surgeon holds a line, with a steadiness that came not from talent alone, but from having done the thing so many times that the nervous system had absorbed it completely. But here is the thing the sister cannot move past, the thing that sits underneath all the grief and all the unanswered questions and all the Investigative dead ends like a foundation that everything else rests on whether she wants it to or not. If her sister could have backed into that space, then whoever made her stop at that lot knew she could. Whoever chose that location, chose that entrance, chose that specific gap between those specific pieces of equipment, they knew what they were asking. They knew the driver they were asking it of. And they asked it anyway, in the dark, off a road she had no logged reason to leave, which means that the stop was not random and the location was not chosen casually, and the person or people who orchestrated whatever happened on US 50 in Kinsley, Kansas on a Thursday night in September had done enough prior work to know that the driver of that refrigerated unit was capable of something that most drivers weren't. She was running dairy from Wichita to Dodge City, US 50 westbound, flat country, a road she had done dozens of times, a route so routine that the last communication she sent, a text to her mother at 10:50 p.m., was 3 words, the same 3 words she sent on every run, on my way. Not unusual, not a sign of anything wrong, just the text she sent every time, the small ritual of contact that said I'm moving and I'm fine and I'll be there when I said I'd be there, which was the kind of driver she was, the kind of person she was, the kind of communication that meant nothing on the nights. Everything went normally and would have meant everything if anyone had known it was the last one. The truck was found at 6:30 the next morning by a farm equipment dealership employee arriving to open the lot. He pulled into the gravel entrance, the same gap, and found the refrigerated trailer already there, inside the gate, between the equipment, running. His first thought, he told investigators, was that a driver had come in after hours to make a delivery and used the wrong entrance, which happened occasionally with GPS misrouting. His second thought, 30 seconds later, when he saw there was no cab attached to the trailer, was that something was wrong. There was no tractor, just the trailer, dropped on its landing gear, refrigeration unit humming, perfectly positioned between the equipment. The tractor was found 2 miles east on US 50, pulled onto the shoulder, engine off, no key, no driver, no indication of why it had stopped there or how the trailer had ended up in the lot. The chain on the lot gate had been undone, not cut, not forced. The padlock was open, hanging from one loop of the chain, as though someone had a key or had opened a padlock in the dark through some other means. The dealership owner confirmed that a small number of keys existed for that padlock. None were missing from the hooks where they were kept. None of the people who legitimately held a key could be placed at the location that night. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation ran the key angle for 6 weeks and found nothing that went anywhere. No footprints on the lot's surface because the lot was paved, which is the detail that investigators noted with the particular frustration of people who needed something physical to work with and found the physical environment uncooperative. The gravel of the entrance showed disturbance consistent with the trailer's passage. Tire marks, weight impression, the kind of evidence that confirmed the trailer had come through that entrance and no other. But nothing that resolved the question of who had been there or how many people or what they had done after the trailer was dropped. The KBI spent considerable time on the theory that she had arranged to meet someone, that the stop was planned from her end, that she had a reason for being in Kinsley at that location at that hour that had nothing to do with her freight route. They found nothing to support it. No communications in her phone records suggesting prior contact with anyone connected to Kinsley or to the dealership. No financial activity indicating a side arrangement. No witness who placed her in Kinsley at any prior time or connected her to anyone with a reason to be at that lot. The theory required her to have planned something in complete absence of any evidence that she had planned it, and after 6 weeks the KBI noted in the case file that nothing supported the hypothesis, and they were moving on. They moved on to nothing. The case went cold in the way cases go cold when every thread that seems like it might lead somewhere leads instead to a wall, and the walls are consistent and solid and offer nothing to grip. Her sister drove US 50 for the first time 8 months after the disappearance. She had specifically requested the route, which her dispatcher had tried to talk her out of and eventually agreed to because she was insistent in a way that made clear it was something she needed to do rather than something she wanted to do. She drove it westbound, the same direction, the same time of night approximately, the same flat Kansas dark with the same spacing of small towns and the same quality of silence on the radio in stretches between. She slowed when she reached Kinsley. She pulled onto the shoulder of US 50 and looked at the entrance to the lot from the road, which is not how you see it from a cab. From a car, you see the full approach, the width of the entrance, the angle of it relative to the highway, the gap between the equipment visible from the road in the way it wouldn't be visible from inside a moving truck at highway speed. She sat there for a long time. What she was calculating, she said later, was the approach, the angle you would need to set up, how far past the entrance you would need to go before initiating the swing, how much you would need to account for the asymmetry of the equipment on either side given that one piece sat slightly further back than the other. She was calculating it not as an exercise but as a kind of evidence, trying to establish for herself whether the backing job was possible in a single pass off a dark highway by someone who had never been to that lot before. Her conclusion was that it was possible, just with a driver who had internalized the mechanics of a backing approach completely enough that the adjustments were happening below the level of conscious calculation in the nervous system rather than the mind. With a driver who had been doing this long enough that the mirrors were an extension of perception rather than a tool being consulted. With a driver who had specifically the kind of patience under pressure that allows you to take an extra 2 seconds to read the approach correctly before committing to the swing. Her sister had all of those things. She had been given all of those things in a gravel yard behind a house over the course of a summer by the person who was now missing. That is the part she cannot release. Not the open padlock, not the missing tractor, not the cold case file with its walls and its dead threads. The part she cannot release is that someone knew the route, knew the driver, knew what she was capable of in the dark with 18 inches on each side, and built a plan around that knowledge with enough confidence to choose a gap that most drivers couldn't have made and leave no room for error. Whoever stopped her on US 50 in Kinsley, Kansas on a Thursday night in September was not guessing about what she could do. They knew her, or they had watched her long enough that they knew her the way the sister knows her. Through the work, through the approach, through the specific and unmistakable signature of a driver who treated precision as the point rather than the means. 18 inches of clearance in the dark. Her sister is the only person she ever knew who could have made that without touching the equipment. That's the part that stays. 6 words, written in his own handwriting, on the interior wall of an empty trailer on a desert interstate in Arizona in black marker, level and neat, with no sign of agitation in the strokes. The kind of writing a person produces when they are calm and deliberate and have decided exactly what they want to say before the marker touches the surface. The kind of writing that is the opposite of a distress note, the opposite of something scratched in panic or haste. And yet the 6 words themselves are the most unsettling thing in a case file that is already full of things that don't resolve cleanly. I knew this was going to happen. That's what it said. 6 words in his handwriting, confirmed by 3 separate analysts, on the wall of a trailer that had been swept clean of every piece of cargo that had been in it 2 hours earlier. A full load of consumer electronics, boxed and palletized, gone not partially, entirely. The trailer interior had been swept, not ransacked. No packing material, no scattered product, no evidence of a rushed offload. Whatever happened to that freight happened in an organized and deliberate way by people who had planned it and executed it with the efficiency of a team that had done this kind of thing before and knew how long they had and didn't waste a second of it. The FBI got involved within 24 hours. A cargo theft of that scale on a federal interstate, with the level of coordination it implied, pulled it immediately out of local jurisdiction and into a different category of investigation. They were looking at a syndicate operation, multiple vehicles, a predetermined offload site, inside knowledge of the route and the timing and the load manifest. That kind of theft doesn't happen to a random truck on a random night. It happens to a specific truck carrying specific freight because someone who knew what was in it and when it would be where told someone else, and the chain of information has a source somewhere. And finding that source is how you unravel the rest of it. But the 6 words complicated the clean narrative of a cargo theft with an inside element. Because a victim doesn't write that. A person who didn't know what was coming, who pulled into a rest stop outside Tonopah, Arizona on a November night thinking it was a routine stop, doesn't write 6 words on the wall of their trailer saying they knew it was going to happen. And a willing participant, someone who set up the theft, who gave the information, who arranged to be at that location at that time, doesn't write it either. A willing participant drives away with the people they were working with, or gets their cut later, or disappears into a life that was funded by the transaction. A willing participant doesn't leave a note, so what does that make him? The FBI has never publicly answered that question. The case file acknowledges the message, acknowledges the handwriting confirmation, acknowledges the absence of any explanation for why it was written or what it means for his role in the events of that night. And then it continues past that acknowledgement into the investigative threads that went nowhere, one after another, until the file runs out of threads and ends. He had been coming through the Petro in Quartzsite for 6 years. Every Tuesday and every Friday, eastbound and westbound like clockwork. That is not a figure of speech in this context, it is a precise description. The waitress who served him for those 6 years said she could set the coffee going when she saw his truck in the lot and have it on the counter the time he sat down. She knew his order before he gave it. She knew his tip before he left it. She knew the rhythm of his presence, the way you know the rhythm of anything that has repeated itself long enough to become part of the structure of ordinary time. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, no butter, coffee. $4 tip always exact left under the edge of the plate. He read whatever was on the counter while he waited. Newspaper, magazine, whatever had been left behind by the previous customer. He was quiet in the way that meant content rather than unfriendly. He never talked about his load, never talked about his route, never lingered longer than the meal required. He was the model of a professional who had made peace with the solitude of the work and didn't need it, filled with conversation to feel whole. He came in that Friday the same as always, same order, same quiet, same $4 tip under the edge of the plate. The waitress said there was nothing different about him, nothing in his face, nothing in the way he ate, nothing in the quality of the silence around him that suggested he was carrying something heavy or waiting for something, or afraid. She has turned that over many times in the years since, and the answer is always the same. He was exactly himself. Exactly the Tuesday and Friday regular who made the job bearable by showing up when he was supposed to and being who he always was. She watched him go back to his truck. She doesn't know why she watched. She says she usually didn't, that she had other tables and other things to do, and no reason to stand at the window following his rig with her eyes. But she watched him pull out of the lot heading east on I-10, and the truck got smaller, and then it was gone. And that was the last confirmed sighting of him by anyone who has ever been found and interviewed. His truck was at the rest stop near Tonopah 2 hours later, 40 miles east. The timeline is tight but workable. A professional driver running I-10 east at highway speed covers 40 miles in under 30 minutes, which leaves over an hour unaccounted for between when the waitress watched him leave Quartzsite and when his truck was found. That hour is where the investigation lives and has always lived, because it is in that hour that whatever was going to happen happened, and the record of it is a swept trailer and 6 words in black marker and a missing man and a load that was never recovered. The logistics of the theft are staggering when you lay them out plainly. A full trailer of consumer electronics represents significant physical volume and significant weight. Moving it requires multiple large vehicles, box trucks at minimum, probably 3 or 4 to handle the full load in the time available. Those vehicles need to be at a location close enough to the rest stop to reach it quickly, staged in advance, with drivers and loaders ready to work. The offload operation itself, done cleanly enough to sweep the trailer afterward, requires organization and discipline and a crew that is operating on a plan rather than improvising. And all of it has to happen within a window defined by the time the truck left Quartzsite and the time it was found, which means the plan had to account for his departure time, his speed, his route, and his stop location with enough precision that the crew was already in position when he arrived. That level of precision requires information. The FBI's working theory was an inside element, someone within the freight company, the shipper, or the driver's own network who provided the route details and the load manifest and the timing. Cargo theft syndicates at that scale of operation run on inside information the way other businesses run on capital. You don't stage 4 vehicles in the Arizona desert on a guess. You stage them on a certainty, and the certainty comes from a person who knows, whether he was that person, or whether that person used him without his knowledge, or whether the truth is something more complicated than either of those options. The FBI investigation ran for 2 years, without arriving at a definitive answer. The syndicate angle led to a network with connections in 3 states. and 2 people were eventually charged with related crimes in a separate case. And neither charge resulted in a conviction, and neither defendant provided information about this specific theft or this specific driver. The 6 words remain the irreducible problem at the center of everything. 3 handwriting analysts looked at the message and confirmed it was his. Not just the letter forms, the pressure, the slant, the specific way he joined certain letters, the unconscious habits of a hand that had been writing in a particular way for days. It was not a forgery. It was not someone who had practiced his handwriting or studied it closely enough to replicate it. It was him, standing in his own trailer, writing on the wall with a marker that was found uncapped on the floor nearby, writing 6 words in the calm and level hand of a person who is not afraid and is not rushed, and has something specific they want to put on record before whatever comes next. I knew this was going to happen. The question that statement refuses to answer is the question that every reading of it eventually arrives at. What does knowing change? If he knew, why did he make the stop? If he was a willing participant, why leave a message that implicates you in your own disappearance? If he was a victim who had been given enough information to anticipate what was coming, why didn't he call anyone, change his route, pull into a way station, do any of the things a person can do on a federal interstate when they believe something is about to happen to them? The waitress has thought about this for years. She has thought about the Friday he came in, the way he was exactly himself, the $4 tip under the plate, the way he read whatever was on the counter without seeming to see it. She has wondered, in the way that people wonder about things they will never have answered, whether he sat at her counter that last Friday knowing what was waiting 40 miles east, and whether the stillness she read as contentment was actually something else. Whether the quiet that made him such a bearable regular was, on that particular Friday, a different kind of quiet. She still sets a coffee cup on Fridays. She has not been able to stop. Her body does it before her mind catches up. The way a routine outlasts its reason, the way a habit formed over 6 years of regular Tuesdays and Fridays doesn't simply end because the person who made it stopped coming. He left $4 under the plate and walked out to his truck and drove east on I-10 and somewhere between Quartzsite and Tonopah. The last chapter of whatever story he was living closed. He knew it was going to happen. He wrote it down so someone would know that he knew. What he didn't write down was why he went anyway. That's the part the 6 words don't answer. That's the part nothing answers. The cup is still there on Friday mornings. If these roads could talk, they would tell you that the highway keeps no secrets. It just keeps them longer than we do. Every case in this series is documented, every detail pulled from real records and real people who are still waiting for answers. If this found you, subscribe to Mr. Darkveil. The dark is just getting started.